guys through really what is kind of a more advanced way of looking at a piece of literature. So, beyond kind of analyzing the different aspects of literature, the different sort of elements that you might find, like a metaphor, a simile, you can approach a piece of literature holistically through something called a critical lens. So, critical lens is basically a field within a field of scholarship, essentially within certain disciplines that examines, a medium. It could be a text, it could be a piece of art, it could be a drama, whatever it might be, through a certain set of ideas or principles or questions. So when you guys look at a piece of literature, you're going to look at, what are the critical theories that you can apply to this one text. And you can look at a text in multiple ways. So, for example, if you took the Hills Like White Elephants by Hemingway, you could look at that from several different perspectives. You could look at it from like a feminist gender queer studies. You could look at it from a deconstruction perspective. You could look at it from a historicism or new historicism. Even psychoanalytical could be really interesting. So there's a lot that you could do with a singular piece of literature based on how you look at it. So when you say the word criticism or critical theory, it obviously doesn't mean negative criticism. It's not a negative connotation. It just means that you're looking at it through a critical lens or eye. So I'm going to kind of walk you guys through these different approaches that you can take when you look at a text through like a critical theory. So new criticism or formalism is the traditional way of looking at literature. It's what you probably did in high school, where you take a piece of literature, you look at what's on the page, and you break that down. It's only concerned with what's on the page. It doesn't take into account the events surrounding the text or the author's own experience or biographical context. This is just what you see on the page and what does it mean. So it could be things like themes, imagery, symbolism, irony, tone. These types of things are the traditional ways that you analyze a piece of literature. Deconstruction does the opposite. It actually looks at what's not being said. So new criticism kind of looks at what's unifying the text to create, meaning. Deconstruction looks at how it falls apart, what's missing, what's not being said, what's the undercurrent of meaning here. So if you have authors, for example, who are especially, from marginalized groups, such as, say, female authors at the turn of the century, they would often include meaning that was directed at their audience. So they would be, criticizing a political entity or, a patriarchal system of oppression, but they would do it not overtly. They would have to kind of put that in the text as subtext so that it would be published, because otherwise it wouldn't have been published. So for example, if you look at this quote, it says love is like a rose. If I was doing this as a new critical theory, I would look at it and say, clearly that's a simile, and it means that love is sweet and delicate and pleasing to pleasing and these other things. If I looked at it from a deconstruction perspective, I would say it's actually thorny and painful and can cut you and, looks wonderful but is very dangerous. So that's how deconstruction is kind of the opposite of new criticism. If you look at historicism or cultural or new historicism, you look at these different elements, social, cultural, historic, and political, and how that surrounds, influences, impacts the work or is conveyed through the work. So you can look at the biographical elements from the author or the historical context around the time of this work. So you might think about not only what was happening, but how did that influence the author, the narrator, the people who this is targeted to, the audience, and how does that influence meaning? So for example, if a text is set in 1943 in London, you may look at the context, surrounding World War II, not World War I, and what the English people were dealing with at that time. What were the battles or conflicts that were taking place at this time? These were the times of the air raids in Britain. how does that influence, the meaning of the work? Or whose perspective is the narrative written from? Is it written from a general? Is it written from, the attacking force? Is it written from an everyday citizen, a farmer, a soldier? And then what was happening politically at this time, or even economically? You could look at, how does the meaning of the work convey certain issues that were taking place at the time in terms of politics or economics, things like that. Biographical, I think is pretty clear. It's looking at the author's own life to see how that influences the work. So you have to be very careful of, secondary interpretations here. So people paint pictures of certain authors, what they lived, what their experiences were. And so, for example, say with Hemingway, we have a very specific persona that we've created around Hemingway. We know the biographical elements of his life, but we've attributed meaning to some of that. So sometimes they do incorporate their own experiences into the work, but you can't always assume that just because an author went through a certain experience that that's automatically indicated in their work. So I'll give you an example here if you've read Sherman Alexie. But it may just be that the author themselves are putting certain elements from historical context or other people's lived experiences into the work, and that what you're seeing is not necessarily, their own lived experience conveyed through the work. Psychoanalytical is another really interesting one. You look at the symbols and language that explain the intent behind a character. So you can look at a character and analyze their motives and their actions. And I note that you can use Freud, or you can use a number of different psychologists really within this. And I am no psychologist, but if you, as a baseline of where you could start, you could look at sort of the id, which is that base instinct, as I understand, the impulsive, the unconscious. It's what people do, within their own cells. So things that they don't control. The ego would be the I, so that's like the unrealistic id is kind of the impulse, and the external real world, what systems of justice and things are put on you as a person. And then the superego is that higher self. It's the one that aligns with society and justice and ethics and societal rules. But I've seen some really fascinating papers written on psychoanalytical approach of characters. If you look in any scholarly database, you can find a lot of scholarship about certain characters being analyzed from a psychoanalytical approach. For example, if you've ever read The Telltale Heart by Poe, you may find that main character could be a really interesting study in psychoanalysis. So there's a lot that you can do with this one. Marxist theory looks at the ideas of power and inequality. So you're looking at things like class structure, economic and social disparities, political evolution and revolution. And these ideas are often found pretty overtly in certain texts. It's a little less nuanced than other theories that you might have to kind of dig to find those theories in certain texts. This one you would see usually pretty clearly within the context of the text. And then there's feminist gender and queer and gender studies and queer theory, and this is together all three of these have been around since about the late 60s, early 70s. Queer theory came into academia in about the 90s. But these criticisms, I've lumped them together here, but they're really separate areas of study. And they deal with the idea of gender or genders, power, and marginalization. So it looks at the manner in which gender and sexuality is discussed and the intersections of identity, examining how normative or exclusive practices reinforce ideas of privilege and how we should dismantle those. It also looks at these intersectionality between masculine and feminine. So traditional ideas of masculine or feminine. So these studies have evolved greatly over the last 10, 20, 30 years. So what was being studied 10 or 15 years ago has now evolved into something almost entirely new. Looking at things like non-binary identities, how, like I said, how you dismantle systems of oppression, and it is a very humanistic approach. So it's a fascinating way to really look at characters in certain texts to see, what are the systems of oppression? How are they being dismantled? Are they being dismantled? That kind of thing. And then last but not least, reader response. This is probably the most used type of criticism. It's your personal experience with the work. So it asks you to read the work and then talk about your own reactions or experiences or emotional connections to the work. This is not something that you typically would see in high-level academia. This is really more something that you use in kind of processing a text before you apply your own, a higher type of criticism, or I say a higher level type of criticism, more complex, I should say, type of criticism to the work. So it does note that you want to be aware of these fallacies, which is basically judging a work based on its emotional effects on you, which is absolutely part of the experience, but it shouldn't be the only way that you analyze a piece of literature. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. It's a really fascinating way to kind of approach a piece of literature. And if you have questions, let me know.